Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today on the show, an exotic mushroom native to Asia is sneaking out of the kitchens and into the wild.
We'll look at the risks of golden oysters taking root in the Midwest.
Plus, Enbridge calls the Line 5 oil tunnel a necessary safety fix. Others say it would sideline treaty-protected fishing and extend oil use.
We'll unpack the trade-offs. Also, it's more than costumes, castles, ladies, and lords.
We'll explore the living history of the Michigan Renaissance Festival.
And Michigan legislators have introduced bipartisan bills to expand menopause and perimenopause coverage.
We'll explore what this chapter in life means for women and why it's been overlooked in policy and healthcare.
But first, earlier this year, a University of Michigan student from China voted in November's presidential election. He was part of a group of likely 16 non-citizens in Michigan who voted in that election. To be clear, that number accounts for a tiny fraction of the vote, less than 0.0003%. And those votes didn't impact the 2024 November election results. But some people were upset by non-citizens voting. So last month, Republicans gathered to launch a ballot initiative to strengthen existing laws that ensure non-American citizens can't vote in Michigan elections. Now, to do that, their initiative would require voters to show photo identification to cast a ballot. Many Democrats, including Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, are against this measure. The voting official says if passed, the initiative could suppress the vote. So what exactly is in this new measure? And what case is Americans for Citizen Voting making to Michiganders to gather the hundreds of thousands of signatures needed to get on the 2026 ballot? To learn more, producer Sam Corey spoke with Paul Jacob. He's chair of Americans for Citizen Voting.
The ballot initiative that you're proposing would require voters to show photo ID to vote. Why are you putting this measure forward?
We think that it's essential that people who are going to vote identify themselves in a documentary way. Let's make sure we know who's voting and that they are who they say they are. And of course, the rules around this are very open. If someone forgot their information, they can still cast a ballot. They just have to come back and show it within 6 days. And, when you think about voting and how important it is that it be something that we all trust, showing ID, you can't get on an airplane without showing ID. You can't adopt a kitten or a puppy without showing ID. You couldn't get the COVID vaccine without showing ID. And it just seems to me, virtually every country in the world has that requirement. It's common sense. And the people of Michigan overwhelmingly favor it. So we think it's a very important component of election integrity.
On the topic of IDs, the proposal is offering free ID cards for people facing hardship. What does that mean? What does that look like? Who are the people potentially facing hardship? And then what are those free IDs?
Well, the Secretary of State is instructed to, provide free identification and a process where anyone can show that they have a hardship getting an ID. Almost everyone has an ID, but we want to make sure that there is absolutely no barrier. And providing it for free is the best way to do that.
But so someone would have to go to the Secretary of State before Election Day. And if they can't afford an ID, they wouldn't have to pay for the ID. Is that right?
That's exactly right. They would not have to pay for the ID. And of course, if they somehow forgot and went to the polls on Election Day, they could say, oh my goodness, I don't have an ID. They could cast a provisional ballot. They could go get an ID and they could come back and show it and be able to have that vote count.
Just to clarify this, on the same day, if someone goes, they don't have ID, and they can't afford the ID, could they get ID that same day at a Secretary of State office, or would they have to do it several days prior?
Well, it's interesting. It will be determined by what kind of rules the Secretary of State has. But the Secretary of State should have rules that are open to people being able to vote. And so I think you'll see that it is very easy to get a free ID and then be able to vote. Now, a Secretary of State could try to stand in the way of that. I don't think they'll do that. And I don't think the people in Michigan are going to elect secretaries of state that are that are problematic when it comes to allowing people to get ID, get to vote, and have that vote count.
What kind of assistance, and maybe this also would be determined by the Secretary of State at the time, but what kind of assistance would be offered to folks on election day if they don't have ID? Currently, as it stands, people can sign an affidavit saying that it's them.
Right.
That would no longer be the case if this ballot proposal were to get enough signatures and then to pass. What kind of assistance would be offered to people on election day?
In terms of getting an ID on election day, I don't think that's going to be the best day to get one, just because I think you're going to have clerks and Secretary of State offices and everybody very, very busy. So it probably makes sense to get your ID before you go vote, or obviously the next day you could go get it because you have 6 days after the election to show that identification, that government photo ID. The rules are not all written. We don't know exactly what the color of the ID will be or all kinds of things, but we know that by law, they'll have to provide that ID free for anybody who needs it.
Part of this ballot initiative also is that you want the Secretary of State to regularly review and purge voter rolls of individuals whose citizenship status cannot be verified. What does that look like? What does that process look like for the Secretary of State?
Well, we're asking the Secretary of State and asking constitutionally, so they shall do so. But we're asking the Secretary of State to check the list and to determine whether people are citizens or not. And, it was said before last election that the list was squeaky clean, there were no problems. And all of a sudden we find out a non-citizen's voting on election day. And then there was a cursory check done using driver's license info and found another 15 non-citizens had voted, suspected non-citizens had voted on election day. And so that's a serious problem. And we want those checks to happen before there's a problem, not after there's a problem. The truth is, if that Chinese student had not gone back to get his ballot, people in Michigan would know nothing about any non-citizens voting. And that tells us there's a problem.
I just want to clarify, there was what you're referring to is a Chinese student at the University of Michigan who voted, who is not a citizen. And what you're saying is we never would have found out if non-citizens voted had that incident not happened. You're saying the Secretary of State wouldn't have checked the rolls after, they wouldn't be doing cursory checks and wouldn't have found non-citizens having had voted.
That's exactly what I'm saying, that had the Chinese student at the University of Michigan not gone back to say, I want my ballot back, I think realizing that maybe it was highly illegal for him to vote, even though all kinds of encouragement. But had the Chinese student not gone back to get his ballot, there would have been no public attention on non-citizens voting, and Secretary Benson would not have done the cursory check of the driver's license. And there's a lot more that could be done. She could contact the Department of Homeland Security and check the list against that. She could contact the State Department and check the list against their lists of citizens and non-citizens. There's all kinds of ways to get more information and be diligent about this. And that's what this law asks the Secretary of State to do. And I think, again, secretaries of states are going to be very open to let's let people vote. If we have evidence that they're a citizen, everything doesn't have to be perfect. But we want that checked.
I'm glad you brought up the Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. She has said that she's against this measure because she says that this is a specific issue, not one that should be generalized because it happens in so few cases. And in talking about the review that you alluded to, the Secretary of State's office did identify at least 16 additional non-citizens suspected of voting illegally in November's election. That was last November. That importantly, that number represents less than 0.001% of that vote. What do you say to someone who doesn't think this is a problem in our electoral system because it happens in such small numbers?
I think it's funny when people come upon a problem and a solution to it and then don't want to fix it. And Jocelyn Benson said at the beginning of this year that she was going to have some reforms to get at this problem, that non-citizens did vote. And we can decide that it's not a problem until enough non-citizens are voting that it clearly determines the outcome of an election. But that's not how we ought to deal with the law. It ought not to be, hey, you can break the law and we're not even going to check unless, we find out after the fact that, oh my goodness, we had an election that just wasn't on the up and up. We want elections that going into them, we have a high level of voter confidence.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm producer Sam Corey speaking with Paul Jacob, chair of Americans for Citizen Voting. His group is working to get signatures for a ballot initiative that would prevent non-citizens from voting by ensuring that voters have photo ID when they do vote. I want to bring up something else to you, Paul, because this has been something that folks who are critical of the initiative have talked about, which is for married women specifically, for those who have changed their last name. One of the issues that folks think about is that they would not be allowed to provide a birth certificate alone to register to vote. That could create more issues for married women, folks who have changed their last name. It doesn't match what's on their birth certificate. What do you make of that issue and them coming, going to the polls, planning to vote? They got the birth certificate, but they can't vote because it doesn't match. What do you make of that scenario particularly?
Well, I think it's it's hyped up and overblown. That the truth is, and it is a hassle. Look, I'm married. I know my wife when, finally changed her name because it was such a hassle not to change her name, and then it was a hassle to change it. So I'm not saying that there's no hassle out there with married name changes, because I know there is. But it has nothing to do with this measure. And we specifically have in the text of the measure that marriage licenses are documentation that is specifically recognized. And you could have trouble voting anytime that you had just remarried. It's not a problem. It's not a big problem. We don't see all kinds of women turned away, and they're not going to be turned away under this under the citizen-only voting amendment. It's anyone who's found not to have the proper documentation, who's on the rolls, is going to be informed and given every opportunity to provide it. And if we think for a second that, we're not going to be able to overcome the idea that a woman has changed her name because she got married, that's just silliness.
I think the broader issue that I think some folks are concerned about is the numbers of people voting who are registered to vote going down, right? So people show up to the polls, they are ready to vote, they voted in the past, they're excited to vote, but they're not able to now because they don't have the proper documentation like they had in the past. Do you worry that the number of people who are registered to vote, who are citizens, won't be able to vote? They either don't have the right documentation, or those numbers will go down. We'll have less civic engagement, less people voting in our democracy because of this proposal.
No, I don't think. I think the citizen-only voting amendment is going to have a positive effect on people voting. One, because I think they're going to come out to the polls to vote for it because they love this policy. Also think this is common sense stuff. This is done all over the world. We do want to make IDs free so that nobody can be because they didn't have the money in their pocket to get one. This is a very fair proposal with thoughts about what if someone didn't have any documentation. Well, there's a process that you can show I am a citizen. This is not rocket science.
I do think this is interesting, and I do want to hold you to this, Paul. Like, you think that if this were to pass, you do think more people would vote in the future. You do think it would actually strengthen democracy. It would build trust in the process. And following election years, we'll see the number of registered voters come out to vote in higher numbers.
I do absolutely think that this measure will bring out more voters in 2026. And after passage, will bring out more in 2028 and more in 2030, because people have confidence in the election process.
I want to ask you, Paul, something on the other end of this. There's an interesting proposal that could have been made, which was we're going to keep the system. Like, if you don't have your photo ID, you can sign an affidavit saying that it's you. Then, before tallying everything up, we're going to check the rolls and we're going to see if you're a citizen or not. Why not write the proposal that way? Why not allow people to vote and then do the check and then tally everything up? Maybe it takes another couple days to get the results, but now we've given everybody a chance to vote. We know that they're citizens, and we've done the check on the back end before we've tallied the numbers. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think that's a terrible idea. And the reason it's a terrible idea is, why would you wait until the heat of an election to start checking whether some of these votes really should count or not count? You want to do that ahead of time. This proposal gives a whole year to do that after it goes into effect.
Well, the last thing I want to ask you about, just because I think it's interesting, is that there are other municipalities, there are places, some cities across the country where non-citizens can vote in municipal elections. That's not true here in Michigan, at least to my knowledge, but it is true in some other states and particular cities. I'm wondering just what you make of that, what your reaction is to that.
I don't like it. I think citizenship is so important that I don't think we should have non-citizens vote at any level of government. And, someone can say, well, what about someone who's here a long time? Look, I want them to become citizens. This is a country of immigrants. And if we're going to remain as vibrant a country as we have been, we better continue to be a country of immigrants. But there needs to be a process whereby we all are citizens and we're all on the same page, we're all in the same spot, and we've all made a commitment that, yes, we are part of this country. And that's what we want people who come here to do.
That was producer Sam Corey speaking with Americans for Citizen Voting Chair Paul Jacob about his initiative to require voters to show photo ID to cast a ballot. During the conversation, Jacob said Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson isn't doing enough to stop non-citizens from voting. Secretary Benson has said she wants other checks on the system, like legislation to make it easier to retrieve ballots from polling sites. But she says she's against the photo ID ballot proposal because it could make it harder to vote. Up next, voter turnout is often low in Detroit. We'll have some of the answers as to why. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us.